All right. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm Bartiz Cox, and I direct the marketing and communications at Groundswell. And today we're going to be having a conversation about agrivoltaics, the energy, water, and food nexus, led by Greg Barron-Gafford, an associate professor at the University of Arizona. We are really happy to see you here. Just something at the top for everyone to remember. There is a hand-raising function if you've signed in on Zoom that you can click and raise your hand and queue up to ask questions directly to the panelists if you'd like. If you would rather put a question in a different way, you can write it into the chat bar, and I'll be monitoring that and asking questions throughout the conversation. So thank you, and I'm going to hand it off to Michelle Moore.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today. I am very grateful to be introducing another one of our Energy Futures webinars. We kicked this series off a few weeks ago to share an hour together every Thursday at noon, a lunch and learn, if you will, covering topics to really help inform the energy futures that we want to build. You know, the whole conversation kicked off with Ari Wallach of Longpath. You know, we talked about future being a verb. So with the ideas that we're exploring together today and throughout this series, you know, Groundswell's thought is really to learn and listen and understand how in this in-between time that we're all still in, we can re-envision how we want to rebuild together. Together nationally. I know today we have many international visitors with us on this webinar, and locally as well. So I'm grateful that Greg is with us today, you know, to talk about the intersection between solar and agriculture and water use as well. And joining us from Rome, Georgia, is Sam Burnham, who's a curator of all the biscuits in Georgia and a localist and a local advocate for community power. So Sam is going to help to lead us in some Q&A following Greg's presentation today. So echoing Bartiz, please, you know, chime in throughout the process using the chat function or the QA to queue up the questions that you may have. And welcome, you know, to all the folks who are joining the conversation today, you know, leaders from around the world and leaders from within Groundswell as well. Our distinguished fellow, Unica Rogers-Sipp, who worked for many years with historically African-American owned farms in the South, you know, bringing solar forward as a strategy for regenerative agriculture. And I know that Greg is going to speak to many other leaders in this field as well. It's an exciting area. So with that, I am going to shift over and join all of you in the audience, and I look forward to learning together in this next hour. So, Greg, please take us away.
Great. I'm trying to share my screen now. Does everything seem okay, Sam? Anyone else? All right. Well, I think so. So again, my name is Greg Barron-Gafford. I'm from the University of Arizona. And it's really great to be here today to talk to you about this idea of agrivoltaics. I'll get more to that word again in a minute. I will add that there are a lot of names on this slide. There are a lot of names on this slide because when you're mashing up studies of the food systems and the energy systems and water futures, you're dealing with a lot of different physical sciences, but not just the physical sciences. You have to understand the social dimensions of these different independent issues before you can even try to put them together. You have to understand policy and law. And there's a lot of people involved here, and so here are some of their names. I also want to highlight that the names of the folks in orange are all some of our undergraduate researchers pictured here for the ones that are working with us right now. And I mention them because so often undergraduates get left out of sharing the joy of the research we're doing, but they're such a big part of it. And so I really like to highlight them here as well. So why are we even talking about this? I'm going to minimize my picture here. Well, we have this challenge, right? So many of us want nearly free energy, and we want it nearly everywhere. A colleague here at the university, Neil Armstrong, not that one, a different one, mentioned this as like a global challenge for us. And some of this is possible because we've seen this drastic reduction in the cost of photovoltaic renewable energy. Whether you're thinking about it at the residential, commercial, or utility scale, we've seen an incredible drop in pricing. And that's allowed for a lot of adoption. If you look at these two bars from the Department of Energy, just coincidentally in some groundswell coloring, you can see between 2016 and 2019, this great jump in the amount of renewable energy, the percent of renewable energy for each of these states. And the optimist in me sees this really big jump between this 3-year period across all of these places. The person in me who sees the need for more work is that a lot of these states are in single digits still. In Arizona, where we get so much sun, we're only at 6%. So clearly there's more to do. Places like California, where they're getting nearly 20% of their energy from renewables, they're starting to run into this challenge of where do we put it? So if the prices have come down and people are recognizing the benefits of renewable energy, I think our next big challenge is how do we increase this solar generation out on the landscape? Where do you put this solar? Well, a lot of times this solar production ends up running into some of our food production lands. And I want to show these slides to remind us that land is not out there just for renewable energy. Food production, as we're seeing here on the left, is something that we get from our landscapes already. And a lot of times, I mention this slide especially for people who are not familiar with the western half of the United States as much. There's a lot of food production that comes out of the western United States. You can see that some of California and even southern Arizona is really in these dark red, these high value areas. But climate change is going to put all kinds of pressures on the sustainability of our food systems. And from NOAA, we've got this graphic on the white showing an increase in the water stress index under projected climate change, with increased variability in our precipitation and warmer temperatures. And altogether, that's going to impact how we produce our food. And I know we're talking about energy today, but we're also talking about food production because of the intersection of these two land uses. And you can see that for a lot of the United States, that there are large parcels of land who are going to experience a real challenge in terms of maintaining our food production. But those warmer temperatures aren't just important for the food production itself. We can see this decline in agricultural yields, but also this increase in the people that we might lose from this temperature stress, the food producers and the farm workers who are out there. And so tying into the justice component of previous groundswell presentations, I think it's important to remember that there are people out there working in the heat to bring us that food. So is there something we can do for them in the process? Well, one solution we've talked about is this idea of co-locating renewable energy and agriculture. And we created this word, at least so we thought at the time, agrivoltaics. This is simply a mashup of the word agriculture and photovoltaics, squish it together. And coming from science, as hard as we try, sometimes we talk in acronyms, and sometimes we even make up words for some reason to describe what we're talking about. But in a great interview with some folks, Eleanor Green at Green America, she said, "Oh, I get it. You're just a farm that harvests the sun twice." Like, well, thank goodness for reporters, right? And so this is how we're describing our project right now. And you can see that there are some students working at one of our research sites helping us with the observation. We'll touch on them in a little bit later. So now we've gotten to an understanding of our food systems vulnerable. We want more renewables. Why don't we just stick solar everywhere? Well, actually, renewable energy can be vulnerable to climate change. And so here is a graphic from the National Renewable Energy Lab. The darker colors show those areas that are more prone for kilowatt hours per meter squared in terms of the production capacity. And what do you think when you see this map? It's a map of kilowatt hours, so the solar resource on the average Al Roker delivery of our weather. You might say that could look at a map of temperature. And that's exactly right. Some of these places with the greatest solar potential are some of the warmest on our landscape. And so that's actually a challenge when you look at this graph. So this is a picture of the efficiency of solar panels with increasing temperature. And for those of you who are not thinking about Celsius all the time, 25 degrees Celsius, like the edge of this graph, is about 77 degrees Fahrenheit. So think, how often is it above 77 degrees in these really sunny locations? Pretty often, right? And so as our climate is warming, renewables are going to be under increased pressure to actually perform. So can we do something about that too? And I like to say that I Googled this twice to make sure this is actually an Albert Einstein quote. But just to remind you that all of us come at problems from different ways. And I came from a dryland environment, thinking about ecology. And as Einstein says, look deep into nature and you can start to understand everything better. And I started to think about how plants grow in the shade of other plants, right? This is a core concept in agroforestry, where we're co-locating, wood production and food production, and started to make the connection, right? If we're trying to harvest the sun twice, there is some potential here. There are some examples in nature, right? And that's part of how we got to this topic. So really what we're trying to do is, now that we have these ideas, is what I've got here is some drawings of solar panels you wrap on the ground, either with native grasses or prairies for pollinators underneath, or food production underneath. And we're actually trying to take advantage of multiple benefits to see if we can create a more sustainable future. And in ecology, we call these novel ecosystems, where you mash things together and try to make the best of it. We wanted to know, can we adapt our food systems to survive through periods of drought and temperature stress? And we're doing that by growing the plants in the shade of the overstory solar panel, getting some protection from that midday sun that can be so harsh in so many landscapes. Can we improve renewable energy production? You might be saying, well, how does that happen? Well, these little blue arrows represent transpirational cooling. Just like we perspire, plants transpire when they lose water. And just like perspiration in our own skin helps us cool off, transpiration can be a cooling process. And so we wanted to know, can transpiration from plants actually cool the solar panels overhead? It sounds pretty crazy, right? We know theoretically this happens, but we had no idea if this would work. And so we had to try it. We had to do the science to figure it out. And remember, we're trying to cool down these solar panels so that we can move them up this graph in terms of temperature. Because if you can cool them down, you should be able to increase their efficiency. And the last part of food, energy, and water is the water. Just think, if you spilled your water bottle out in the sun versus somewhere in the shade, which environment stays wet longer? The areas in the shade, right? And so can we now be more efficient and take a more sustainable approach to our water use? And we really come at this thinking about how ecosystems provide us with all kinds of services, right? We get so many things from our landscapes, but you can't get them all the time, or can you? Right? So in natural landscapes, we get plant biomass. You can attract pollinators. You can scrub carbon out of the atmosphere. You can create localized cooling. But if you switch to a purely energy-based ecosystem, you're producing energy, but how much of these other factors are you giving up? And how much are you willing to give up? How can the economics around this work so that you can modify the optimization of energy production so that you can enhance more of these other benefits? So this is the broader conversation we were trying to push with this idea of co-location. And what we've shown here is the size of these bubbles actually suggest how much of a benefit or a level of this service we expect to get. And that's why we're looking at these different services here. The other part we want to do is try to get past this either or in terms of these left two figures. We want to get past either or natural ecosystem or photovoltaic installation. And a colleague, Emily Warman, created this graphic to think about that in terms of energy production. A typical photovoltaic system can produce energy. An agrivoltaic system can potentially produce even more energy. Look at the width of these bars. Water conservation is possible within this agrivoltaic system. Food is produced in both of these systems, potentially more in an agrivoltaic system. And we definitely see the potential for increased revenue when you're essentially harvesting the sun twice. And I don't want to get into too much plant ecology today, but I imagine one question that is coming up is, can plants even grow in the shade? I remember in biology class, plants need sunlight, water, nutrients. Sunlight usually comes up first when we talk to kids about this project. One really cool thing, if you actually measure photosynthesis levels across a variety of light levels, you can see that photosynthesis does increase with light levels. So no, your biology teacher did not lie to you, but it plateaus off. It doesn't go on forever. And so what we're doing is taking advantage of the fact that our high light environments are way beyond that saturation point for plants, way beyond where they're getting some more gains. And so the point is, you can actually cut out 2/3 or 3/4 of the sunlight. That does not mean you're cutting out 2/3 of the photosynthetic potential. And what's the other thing that happens in the shade? Typically it's cooler. So this plot is photosynthesis versus temperature. And again, plants are usually hovering beyond their optimal temperature during that midday sun. And so being in the shade can move you to a cooler aspect. The question really is, how efficient is this trade-off here? We had to do the research to identify which plants are most suitable for this approach, right? The answer is not the same for every plant. It's not the same for every region. And so it takes a collective of researchers doing this work. And this graphic here is to highlight just some part of that collective. So this graphic is from the INSPIRE project, the Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Lab program, about looking into this idea of co-location. And I also have a picture of one of our undergraduate researchers, Jovan, who came from the Pueblo Nation in New Mexico. And in talking with Jovan before she came out, it's like, oh, this sounds really cool, a new way to think about agriculture. And when she got here, she had the same realization. We're adapting from nature. And Jovan shared that her grandfather grows their carrots in the shade of the overstory tree. So a very similar concept. This is a form of adaptation of 4,000 years of food production in the drylands of our world. And we've just revitalized it. And I note that this is a global movement. There are people across the United States, in Oregon, in Pennsylvania, in California, and then more globally, who've been doing this research for a good decade now. And part of one great thing of the internet is that it connects us in new ways that we weren't connected before, right? So more locally, let me walk you through a little bit of the research that we've been doing. We call this our Agrivoltaics Learning Laboratory. What we've done here is essentially elevated the racking system of a traditional ground-mounted solar array. Because remember, we were doing this about 10 years ago, and it just seemed really like a crazy idea at the time. And so we needed to see what we could do to minimize the changes we were putting into the system as much as possible and allow for this co-location. And one of the first comments we got from some of the local farmers is, I need to be able to drive my regular tractor through there for initial ground preparation. All right, so we lifted this array up 10 feet. We've moved on from that, and there's all kinds of cool adaptations we can talk about later if anyone's interested, where you don't have to have so much infrastructure. This really is overkill at this point. All right, so let's examine this in terms of food, energy, and water. Here are a bunch of our undergraduates and high schoolers measuring some of our plants. We have these cool contraptions that you can actually clamp on a leaf. And it's like when you go to the doctor and they take your pulse and your blood pressure to see how you're doing. This is how we take the snapshot of how you're doing of these cabbage plants, of these tomato plants. We measure their photosynthetic rates in real time. And one good thing to remember or to learn, if you're not a farmer, if you're coming from the industry side of things, is that plants are always green, but they're not always doing photosynthesis. And so here's another graphic. We're looking at net photosynthesis on this y-axis and time of day on the x-axis. And in all of my graphics, plants or situations under the PV or under the photovoltaics or agrivoltaics will be in blue because it's cooler, right? The open sun is in red. And what I mean is, even out in the open sun, plants come on when the sun comes up in the morning. They do lots of photosynthesis. They love that moderate sunlight, the diffuse light, the cooler temperatures, the higher relative humidities. But around here in the drylands of Arizona and lots of the world, photosynthesis can only happen for an hour or so. Sometimes it can be stretched out for up to 4 hours, but plants are not doing photosynthesis all day. And so we wanted to know, could growing in an agrivoltaic setting, we take a hit in terms of our maximum potential, but can the better microclimate underneath allow you to function long during the day? Imagine if you had to hang out all day outside in the open sun versus the shade. This might be a good map of your efficiency or your ability to deal with things. Well, we measured that thing all day. We measured photosynthetic rates. And you can see for a few crops that are highlighted in this one paper, chiltepine pepper is a native pepper to our region. You can see they loved being in the shade of photovoltaics, a lot more carbon uptake. Jalapenos were a little bit less in terms of the carbon uptake, and tomatoes did a lot more production because they were shielded from that midday sun. And plant nerds like me care about photosynthetic rates, but if we want to think about what farmers might care about in terms of production, here's a graphic of that. For those same 3 species, we can see the chiltepine production was a lot greater. And this is important because it's a pepper that's native to the region. It's also a very high value crop. So there's lots of economic potential for co-production here. And look at the tomato co-production is so much greater in the PV. And again, some of that is because of the plant's ability to do more photosynthesis. And part of it is because the plants can actually flower and fruit, whereas they can't always in the summer in these dryland regions. And at this point in our installation, we've tested a bunch of different types of crops. Measure this leafy greens and carrots and melons, potatoes, and we've gotten some good results, some encouraging results, but some mixed results. And again, that underscores the need for more research to be done beyond this one site around the country. And that's part of why we need to network all of our efforts together. So let's move on for the sake of time to energy. So in this plot, we're looking at photovoltaic surface temperature. Remember, that's connected to the efficiency of solar panels. And the traditional ground-mounted panels at the site are here in gray. And the agrivoltaic panels are in blue. And you don't have to be a fancy pants scientist to see that the blue lines are going lower up on the graph, so they're not warming up as much. And we're seeing an average cooling about 9 degrees Celsius, or about 17 to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. That's significant. And we want to remember that the cooler temperatures mean the panels are operating more efficiently. There should be less wear and tear on the system. And we literally are pushing these temperatures, these solar panels cooler, which should translate to an efficiency. And through some modeling effort, we've been able to find that this will actually increase the efficiency of these solar arrays. So that's another cool finding. Now let's imagine you're a farmer concerned about water, or you're from a water conservation district. Here's a plot of soil moisture. And every one of these spikes is when we irrigate. So that's what these spikes are every other day. And I want to point out that the microclimate under that solar array is so much cooler and shadier that the water is lasting long in the soil. And that's not a big surprise. That's something we would expect, but we had to enumerate it. And you can see that the soil moisture levels right before that next day's irrigation pulse is about the same as it was after 2 days, is about the same as it was in the control system after about 2 to 3 hours. And again, that is a significant water savings. And now we're starting to wonder, can marginal lands be more arable lands because we've added solar overhead? Can we actually reduce our water use and create a more sustainable water future? And as the prophet Steve Carell would say, that's a win-win-win situation for American and UK audiences. And because I can't go into all the science, it's summarized here in this Nature Sustainability article. I'll provide a link for it or a notice about it later. Some other surprising facts is that you can really change the growing season of your plants underneath. So this is a picture of carrots. Carrots are something you would typically plant in late October, November here in Arizona. Well, we work at a high school and the kids were saying, well, if you change the environment, can you change the seasonality? Well, let's try it. And so we planted carrot seeds in an agrivoltaic setting and in the open sun setting. And the plants in the open sun, they died for science. It was sad, but we learned some things. And here's a graphic from November when you should have carrots going. Look, it's already harvest time in the agrivoltaics. And here's one of our great teachers harvesting that carrot. So we're able to extend the growing season, both in terms of the warm side of things and the cold side of things. We find that agrivoltaics prevents freeze damage for the plants underneath. And just think about the similarities in terms of a cloudy night where you live. On cloudy nights, it warms up so much that we keep warmer temperatures during the evening, because all that energy that our sun has absorbed radiates back out and gets trapped by the clouds overhead. Similar phenomena here, right? So again, we're extending the growing season. And here's some kids from our research site at their elementary school. And there's a basil plant that's about 7 feet tall because it grew year round, which was pretty amazing. So I'll end with saying that we're trying to build a more resilient future and helping kids think about resilience in terms of food production, helping them see a future for themselves in food production, working with a school garden program here at the university. Then we bring them up to the Biosphere Research site and help them see that the research they're doing is the same kind of research we're doing. There's a lot of validity what they're doing. And man, I tell you, elementary kids ask the best hard questions. And again, this is happening around the US and around the world under the guidance of Jordan Macknick, who manages that Inspire program I mentioned. People are thinking about PV plus grazing, PV plus pollinator production, PV plus honey production. We're looking at this project in East Africa, thanks to some UK partners who are listening in today. And I encourage you to also think about looking into Jack's Solar Garden, a super cool example of community solar and community food production coming together. And so I'm going to end with saying that we've done a lot of science. We understand that the climate is changing. We understand that COVID and all other kinds of pandemics disrupt our life. They disrupt our ability to have a sustainable future. And the public is ready for a solution. Our article came out in September and garnered 69,000 hits on Reddit, which was just mind-blowing. And if you read the comments, it's not the usual trolley kind of comments. It's lots of upbeat, like, this is refreshing. And because of the interest we've seen in this topic globally, we feel that the public really is ready for a solution, and we feel like we're tapping into something. And I look forward to hearing your questions on how you push us to think more about this. And if you really are already are in the science realm of things and you want to participate in an Agrivoltaics conference, there's going to be one in France, fingers crossed, in August of 2020. But we're looking into a strong virtual option for those of you who are not going to be able to travel. So I want to say thanks to all of my friends and partners, and thanks to you all for listening, and thanks to Groundswell for showing some interest in spreading the word about this potential solution. And look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions through Sam. Thanks.
I'd like to start with one question. You mentioned the COVID crisis that we're in right now, and I think a lot of people are looking to local options for food rather than a lot of the factory setups that we've had, especially with some of the food processing plants falling under, having their own cases and whatnot.
Yes.
How would this impact, or would it impact the idea in local food of putting more people on smaller tracts of land? Do you need a lot of land to do this?
Yeah, great question, Sam. And I would say one challenge has been for us to do our research at larger scales, like the tens or hundreds of acres. One really cool thing about that is that most of the research is being done at the community farm kind of scale. So the mom and pop farms, the farms that are bringing food to the regional hubs, the local hubs. And so we're trying to explore more of how we can tap into some of the regional foods in each of these places. So one of our research sites here in Arizona we've modified it this year to be truly focused on more regional crops and foods that our populations are more interested in. Because you're absolutely right. With so much volatility in the world right now, just look at us in terms of quarantine. We're hunkering home. And so the more hunkering home we can do in terms of our food and energy production, all the better.
Another one, you were talking about the use of the shade and the use of the transpiration, and made me think about the old Mississippian cultures doing the three sisters, the corn, the beans, and the squash. And they were using the same concept, shade and the squash, corns and beanstalk, the whole thing while they worked together. So I thought that was fascinating. Does your transpiration numbers, does that change between an arid climate like you are in Arizona as opposed to what we have here in Georgia?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And so thankfully, the Department of Energy is catching on to the fact that this is becoming a question that comes up more and more in terms of how well can co-location solve some of our challenges around land use and land use competition. And so part of what we've been proposing through Department of Energy is to repeat some of our measurements around the continental US and around the globe, actually. I was just early on a call with folks from France for that conference we were talking about, and people from all over the world will be there. But back more specifically to your question, absolutely. So the level of transpiration that plants do varies throughout the day. It varies for that same plant, whether you have it growing in a shady place or a sunny place. It varies seasonally. And so you really have to kind of accrue all those different types of measurements into this broader understanding. So part of what we're trying to do is in our next round of measurements, we're trying to connect with people in Colorado, Oregon, Texas, and California, which represents a pretty good range of climates. And I will say, Sam, that there's even a project going on at the Carter Farm down there in Georgia, thankfully, so you're represented. And by making those measurements across all those spaces, we'll be able to plot out an idea of what is the cooling potential of solar panels in these different regions. And the flip side is, each of these places experience different types of stress. And so what kind of benefits do you get from there?
So we have a specific question about the science of agrivoltaics in the mid-Atlantic region. Are there examples of successes, and what scale of solar there?
Right, so they're mid-Atlantic. Like I'm thinking North Carolina on up, or
Probably,
well,
that'd be my guess. North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland,
okay,
that area.
Perfect. Well, there's a experimental area going on in North Carolina. That one has actually focused more on the idea of co-location of solar and sheep grazing, which is another really cool thing to think about. Is a lot of these large-scale solar installations, either they leave the ground bare because they don't want any plants growing up over the solar array, which again, we talked about transpiration being this cooling effect that happens in nature. If you get rid of all that cooling effect, you can expect your system to warm up in a solar array. And now that we really know that we don't want that, you plant more plants. Well, you have to mow them somehow, either mechanically or with things that want to eat. And you mentioned, even the meat industry having some closures and thinking about local meat production. How much better would it be to mow down your pollinator species at the right time with sheep? Goats aren't working. They like to eat everything and they chew looking up. So they eat wires, but sheep have turned out to be really great. And that's a project going on in North Carolina. And moving farther north up the Atlantic, there's an experiment going on in Massachusetts that we can provide a link to, where they've seen some promising results.
Now, as far as the livestock, I'm in Georgia. What about hogs?
I don't think I've seen any examples of photovoltaics with hogs. There was a really good article that came out just this last month about co-locating solar energy and chickens underneath. And you think about 50 cents an egg, you can really add up some food production on terms of the plants and the egg production. But I haven't seen too much on hogs yet, Sam. Maybe we've got a project in our future.
Possibly. Since you mentioned chickens, and you're doing like a pasture raised situation with that, with the birds being outside, do we have any numbers that would prove that we've got protection from predators, hawks, owls, eagles?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I believe that the project with the chicken production is more like a homegrown operation where people were doing that work. It wasn't a scientific project. So I don't know that they have studied, that hawk, capture rate of chickens. It certainly would provide some protection from the form of diving that the hawks do, but that's a really good question, a reason to add some science to that practice.
We have a question asking if you're getting a lot of inquiries from farmers or the utility companies about the work that you're doing, wanting
Perfect.
to put in place.
Yeah, great. So with the farmers, we've seen some level of interest. I would say that it's mostly come from the industry who is spreading out into former farmland. So think about where we want our energy is in the urban centers, even if they're smaller urban centers, because you don't want to transport too much energy over long distances because it's so expensive. And so you're seeing more renewable energy pop up in that peri-urban area around cities and towns. And again, that's where food production has been. And so because a study showed about 3 years ago that somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% of renewable energy, solar photovoltaic proposals were shut down in the deliberation phase in terms of talking with neighbors and county commissioners, that they're trying to be a better neighbor and think about bringing solutions. And agrivoltaics is one way to keep that rural agrarian identity in a space when you bring solar into a landscape.
Since you mentioned the Carter Farm in Plains, I know that I've read that they're able to operate like half of the town's energy needs from that solar array. I'm not sure how many panels they have or how much generation power they have compared to what they need to run their town.
Mm-hmm.
So do you know how much we're looking at here to be able not to operate a small town like that?
Oh, wow, you stumped me there, Sam, because I'm not the solar engineer. But it certainly varies with the size of town and their needs and all that, right? Because air conditioning is super expensive, and depending on where you are and how much rely on it. And spending some grad school time in Athens, I remember relying on air conditioning for survival, it seemed. But when I'm glad you mentioned the smaller towns, because again, that's such a rural landscape. And you might think that, as some of the farmers are getting on in age, there's going to be less people doing some of that food production. But that one thing I want to mention about this whole idea of PV plus is the plus underneath doesn't always need to be food production itself in terms of agriculture. It can be serving as pollinator habitat. So doesn't mean that every bit of solar that goes into a township area needs to also maintain that same level of food production. But even if you can be a pollinator resting stop or pollinator habitat for all of your neighbors around the edges, then you're suddenly doing a lot more good than you would have been able to otherwise.
All right. I have a question here about what sort of racking system is necessary for this sort of setup, and how much above the ground do they have to be? Do you have limitations on that?
Right. Good. Well, I'd say so far what we've been doing is adapting to what we got. And so because this has been coming on so new to the landscape, it really depends on the situation. So we've got a project that's building out in Texas where they're going to elevate the panels about 6 feet off the ground. And so that means that you can't grow corn, right? So you can't do cotton. So you have to think about what kind of food production, and again, that means food production either in terms of actually edible fruits and vegetables, or food production in terms of pollinator habitat and honey production. So that's going to vary by landscape. In terms of the racking system, as I mentioned, for our first study, all we simply did was add our regular racked solar on top of basically a steel ramada. But now you see all of these solar installations that are almost like a bent T, where the solar is at an angle, it's fixed. And even there, we've proven that you can take advantage of that, because several of our Tucson area school district schools have solar on site. And by partnering with schools that already do school gardening programs, we've added an agrivoltaic installation by just doing some gardening under that solar array. So part of what we hope to do with our future projects is see how different racking systems allow you to play with optimization. How well can you optimize for energy production or food production or both? And so I would say for those of you who are thinking about this, it really varies, and there's opportunities for nearly all kinds of panel heights.
I have a quick question. I'm sorry, Sam, just to jump in really quick. We have a question here from Pat Brewer that came in on the Q&A. What are some next steps in implementing this research at market scale? Should we expect to see 50 to 200 megawatt solar farms utilizing these studies in the near future?
Mhm. Yeah, great, thanks. If that's the Pat that I think it is, great question, Pat. So it varies around the landscape for sure. So there are several companies who are putting in solar for their own factory production. And now they're adding pollinator habitat under those solar arrays. The project in Texas it's on that order of magnitude. We're talking about hundreds of acres. And again, hundreds of acres of food production is one challenge. Hundreds of acres of pollinator habitat is a completely lower level challenge where you can enable food production simply by being a pollinator. And again, this varies by landscape. So I'm in Arizona, just hopping across the border into California. We have all kinds of different water restrictions and water needs and water costs. And we've been talking with a partner out there with one of the largest berry producers. Try not to give away any names, but they produce a ton of berries, and they send those berries all over the country, which means they have to refrigerate a lot of those berries. And so they need a lot of power. And if they've already covered their entire factory with solar, they're actually starting to take land out of production to enable them to have consistent on-site energy. And this is one example of if you're producing, let's say, something we know does really well in the shade, like raspberries and blueberries, boysenberries, all those cool kind of berries. They already grow in the shade. And so you could enable large tracts, like hundreds of acres of land, go into solar and maintain your berry production depending on your landscape.
Back to you.
We have a question about explain how the solar rays penetrate the voltaics in order to nurture the plants below. Can you give us a little bit more insight about the amount of light that's reaching the plants that are under the panels?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, this is part of the question that we get when we think about different regions of the globe. So different places have different light intensity and different, lengths of season where they're in full sun. And so that's certainly important to keep in mind. There's also different kinds of solar arrays, right? So typically we've done a single facing solar array, and these are the ones you're probably imagining with black squares over a white background. And those are pretty opaque. There's not a lot of light getting through, but there is usually a gap around the perimeter of each of those solar panels. And as you elevate them off the ground, you allow for more diffuse light to reach under those solar arrays. So a dense solar array can still be as bright as your back porch on a sunny day, right? Because you get all that diffuse light underneath. Part of what we're trying to study in the next generation of agrivoltaics experiments is the use of bifacial solar. So solar panels that are bifacial, they have solar collectors on both sides. And so can you take advantage of the diffuse light that's reflected off of these plants to increase production on that backside of the panel? The other part of that is because you're trying to let some of the light through for those bifacial panels, it means you don't have that white coating in the back. So you actually increase the amount of direct and diffuse light that can hit the plants underneath.
We've got a question about storage. What about the storage issue for renewables?
Okay.
So you're totally able to address, but not sure you're totally able to address, but what can you give us about storage and what would be needed in order to make this work?
Right. Well, so in about half the projects that I'm a part of, we are grid connected, and the other half we're not grid connected, and so requires some level of storage on site. The project that's building up in Africa is going to be more of an ungrid connected system. In terms of storage, there's been a lot of development in terms of battery storage in recent years. That's really not part of what I do. We've thinking about, does this photovoltaics combination with food production impact storage at all? I can't imagine why it would. If anything, I could anticipate it'd be a pure hypothetical hypothesis here, but if you're cooling the local environment and your storage facility for those batteries is on site and you again brought the temperature down in that system, maybe it'd be less wear and tear on the storage, but otherwise there's no difference in terms of renewable energy storage for this agrivoltaics approach versus a regular photovoltaic approach.
So what sort of, I mean, I know you've given us the transpiration and whatnot. Is there a way to enhance irrigation by using photovoltaics?
Yeah, I mean, enhance it in terms of saving it?
Or in increasing the capacity that you can irrigate?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think most of what we've been addressing is reducing the irrigation needs of these systems. But again, this is part of why, remember that we call it a flower diagram, all those different spokes on the wheels and what different services you get. If you're in an environment where you have high temperatures, but you have available water, either through wells or whatnot, or surface waters, you could purposely choose plants that use a lot of water so that you'd get lots of transpiration to increase that cooling potential for your solar panels. We actually overcorrected in our second round of experiments. In our first round of experiments, because remember, we're really at that early stage of, thinking back to David Letterman, will it float? Can you even grow plants under the shade of solar panels? In our first experiment, mainly because we're in the Southwest, we grew salsa products. So we grew tomatoes, peppers, and cilantro. And we found, wow, those are doing really well in the shade of this. I wonder if we wanted to cool the plants, cool the solar panels even more, we'd pick some even more water wasting crops. If we wanted to reduce the amount of irrigation, we could move towards using more native grasses. Something where you don't require irrigation to keep the system sustained through time, but because native grasses in the drylands have adapted to hold on to their water, you lose some of that cooling potential. So it's almost like you have to pull a bunch of levers and fit a bunch of different puzzle pieces together to get the kind of system that you as the landowner or the stakeholder are looking for and for your region.
And I'm assuming that since it's adding shade to the plants for a lot of more labor-intensive crops, you're actually providing shade for your workers as well that are doing the harvesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I can, I'll share my screen once more and just show you this slide here. So are you seeing that, Sam?
Yes.
Good. So this is a picture of some of the students that we work with at one of our elementary school sites that I mentioned. And you're exactly right. So coming back to that graphic, that the only sciencey figure here, we're looking at the level of mortality in terms of our farm workers under increased temperature stress, like with global change, these increased temperatures that we're going to experience. And so we wanted to test that, thinking about this from a human health perspective. And now everybody knows about these electronic thermometers. You can get this you can get this at your local hardware store or online, but it's just a digital thermometer. You shoot a little laser on yourself and it measures your skin temperature. And when we're working in our agrivoltaics or our traditional open sun agricultural systems, if we've been working in that environment for at least 15 to 20 minutes, time for our skin to acclimate, we'll take our own skin temperature. And the kids love doing this too, right? Because they're shooting themselves with a laser, and you get a little readout of your temperature. And you can see that it cools your surface skin temperature by about 10 degrees Celsius, about 19 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's significant when we're talking about working outside in the sun. And it turns out there's a whole physical health metric called human thermal comfort. And it's related to your skin temperature, your sun exposure, the humidity, wind speed, and those sorts of things. And so we're starting to try to enumerate that too, for exactly the reason you're thinking about, for those people who are out there bringing our food and being out there for 7, 8, 10 hours in partial shade versus out in the sun is going to make all the difference in terms of heat related strokes and frankly their productivity, their ability to continue to work at a brisk pace.
So what about, I know that we've talked, that you showed your graphic earlier, the Southwest and even the Southeast at a smaller level is going to be ideal for solar use. What about, is it going to be very limited to do this up north, like a North Dakota or a Maine or somewhere like that?
Yeah, good question. So thankfully I've got a researcher friend who's moved to Maine last year. And so I hope to get up that way when we can travel again. But in terms of North Dakota, that northwest corner, I'll say that one of our partners and one of the guys that I flashed a picture up earlier of was from Oregon, and they've been doing quite a bit of work around the sheep grazing potential under solar arrays. Clearly, you have shorter growing seasons as you move farther up north in these latitudes. But one example of a family farm, well, actually, try not to use their name, but they sell a product nationally, and they have a solar installation that helps run their factory that's up in Idaho. And they have put pollinator habitat under all of that solar array, and now they're actually able to sell honey. So they have an apiary, and they have, you know, folks who are managing the honey production in Idaho under a solar array, and suddenly that's an additional revenue source. Solar grown food products.
So you're adding an entire product to your product line by
Yeah,
being
absolutely.
able to add honey to it.
Yeah, you're value added, and honey's not cheap, as you might know. And I think that's especially important for the people who are thinking about this from a more ecological perspective with, you know, challenge with colony collapse, some of our bees, and with urbanization and the fractionation up of our natural landscapes, we need to create more landing spots for those pollinators. And why not do it when we're already making the world a greener place in the first place? So actually, our first proposal on this work was about 10 years ago, and we titled it Greening Renewable Energy, because we were literally adding green under the renewable energy production. It wasn't funded, but, you know, that's a story about persistence.
But it sounds like you could open up an option to do that in an urban environment as, you know, a rooftop of a building or something, building even on a smaller scale.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a great transition, Sam, because the University of Arizona is building a rooftop photovoltaic array on one of our newer buildings, and we're talking about putting some green roof and even some little stations of food production up there. But you don't need a fancy new building and a rooftop to do this. There's certainly potential for, coming back to your earlier question about small towns, like, you know, small plots of land, you know, in your city centers where you want to add some renewable energy for energy production in your own system. This is completely appropriate for rooftop and urban farming and urban solar installations. And that's actually how I met the leadership at Groundswell, was going to DC and thinking about this solar for all and community solar programs, and what are the potentials in these urban centers where, you know, we have lots of food deserts, and we don't have to just solve one problem at a time. If we can solve, you know, affordable renewable energy, affordable food production, and save some water at the same time.
Great. And you know, we're coming up on the last 5 minutes, and you know, like, I just want to be mindful of everyone's time and thank Greg and Sam for being here and leading this awesome conversation. But Sam, do you have a final question to close us out?
I think you've done a pretty good job of covering what I had.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Same.
if I can add, Bartise, I would say we've got a website. It's called The Solar Farm. Used to use my own name, but Barron-Gafford's kind of wonky and that sort of thing. So if you just Google Agrivoltaics, you'll find all kinds of resources for the people around the world who are doing this work. If you want to contact me more specifically or see our work, you can just go to thesolarfarm.org, and I'll be glad to field your questions and point you on to resources from there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, you two, and thanks for showing up, everybody. And we will pick this back up in 2 weeks. We'll have a conversation about the media. You know, everyone have a good week. Have a safe weekend, and we'll be back to do this again soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to meet you.